Since most of my messages to you are typically topical, I don't usually go through a book of the Bible or certain verses throughout the Bible, and I might change my approach here in the future, I don't know. But thus far, this seems to have suited this church community well. And so coming up with a message that begins the first Sunday of the new year is something that I gave some serious pause for thought and tried to deliver to you a message that I hope you will find encouraging. Because the title of the message, as you can see from the overhead, is Fearless. And the text of the message is taken from Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. And although my comments to you this morning will extend beyond verses 1 and 2, I would really encourage you to go back home and read the entirety of Matthew chapter 24 to understand the entire context that Matthew writes for us. But in those first two verses, it says that Jesus then left the temple. As he walked away, his disciples pointed out how very impressive the temple architecture was. Jesus said, "You're not impressed by all the sheer size, are you? The truth of the matter is that there's not a stone in that building that is not going to end up in a pile of rubble." Have you given any kind of thought or attention to some of the drug commercials we see on television these days? You know, they come with all these warnings. And the one that strikes me is this happy couple you see walking hand in hand on the beach, while a voice in the background is warning you about all of the potential side effects that can happen if you actually take the drug, like coughing, wheezing, diarrhea, loss of bladder control, going cross-eyed, growing hair on your back, your head popping off. I mean, like here, it says, tell your doctor immediately if you develop puffiness in your face, changes in urine, swelling of your stomach, and feeling of fullness or dizziness or feeling faint. Have you really paid careful attention? And the one commercial, and I know that it's not just one commercial that says this, several different manufacturers do. So let's say they are advertising some acne medication. We'll call it Zits Away. And then they tell you if you're allergic to Zits Away, don't take Zits Away. Well, how would you know if you're allergic to it if you don't take it? I've never completely understood that rationale. Or have you heard about potential parents questioning whether they even want to bring a baby into the world? Because, number one, global warming is going to melt the ice caps and we're all going to drown. Number two, powerful madmen have the capability of developing nuclear weapons which they will not hesitate to use to further their political ideologies. Or, maybe three, political movements in our country threaten to undo the Constitution or our freedoms or all decent moral law while protecting the privileged few, or maybe even COVID is going to doom us all. We live in a pretty scary world, and it seems like nothing is stable. Everything seems to be constantly changing, but in the midst of chaos, Jesus tells us that we can be fearless. And as we read in Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2, the disciples were very impressed with the massive stones that had been used to construct the temple. And as I've tried to depict on the overhead here, some of the largest rocks were almost 40 feet long, 10 feet high, and weighed hundreds of tons. The gold and the silver and the intricate carvings, both inside and then outside of these buildings, were beyond impressive. It was literally a masterpiece. So to the disciples, the buildings represented something that they thought would always last. The disciples were probably thinking, man, these buildings are beautiful. They're huge. They're enormous. They'll be here forever. And Jesus' response to their awe? Not a stone would be left standing. Now, that's not particularly encouraging, is it? But in 70 AD, that's exactly what happened. The Romans had grown tired of the Jewish people's constant rebellion. So the army, under the direction of Emperor Titus, with Tiberius Julius Alexander as his second in command, sacked the city of Jerusalem. It was completely and utterly destroyed. According to Josephus, who is a Jewish historian who had been sent by the Romans in an attempt to negotiate peace with the residents of the city of Jerusalem, Roman soldiers had grown furious with Jewish attacks and their tactics and set an apartment adjacent to the temple on fire. Unfortunately, the fire spread to the temple itself and melted the gold that was inside. So after the Roman soldiers had killed an estimated 1.1 million people, most of whom were Jewish, the Romans then overturned every stone of the temple. And they did that so that they could salvage the gold that had seeped into the cracks between each of the blocks. In fact, the only evidence of the old city is what's now known as the Wailing Wall, which seems pretty appropriate given its tragic history. In other words, the very same buildings that the disciples thought would last forever were destroyed within 40 years of Jesus' prediction. In fact, some of those same disciples to whom Jesus may have been speaking may have been alive to see the carnage for themselves, but perhaps from a distance. So, faced with the prospect of destruction, the disciples then asked Jesus a very logical question. Okay, if you're telling us about all these stones being overturned and not one is going to be left remaining standing, then tell us a little bit about the future, Jesus. We'd like to know. And Jesus reveals that several crises will take place before he returns. But I think it's not just knowledge that Jesus wanted to share with the disciples. He wanted the disciples to be prepared by letting them know, by giving them information, so that nothing would take them by surprise. And what Jesus is telling them is that it's not going to be pretty, and it's not going to be easy. And for us, it's not a time just to play church. And Jesus starts out by saying that there's a lot of deceivers that will come and lots of people will be deceived. Church, I think, and religion, it seems, have always been a breeding ground for so-called messiahs. And they come and they go throughout history with a great deal of regularity. They use words like, well, God told me, or God led me, or perhaps even better, God spoke to me. And they all seem to have very frequent sit-downs with the Almighty. But Jesus said there would be a time of spiritual crisis and confusion, waves of strange teachings that sound really good, but aren't. And we're living in a time of false religions, and at least it seems to us the truth appears to be maybe losing ground even. Later in Matthew chapter 24, verse 24, Jesus warns of the following. Fake messiahs and lying preachers are going to pop up everywhere. Their impressive credentials and dazzling performances will pull the wool over the eyes of even those who ought to know better. But I've given you fair warning. In other words, there's going to be slick appearances and these miraculous performances. There'll be multitudes and miracles. There'll be large audiences and spectacular deeds. There'll be throngs of people, displays of remarkable power. But don't be impressed by the numbers or by the tricks or by the hucksters. Because frankly, it seems like everyone's looking for the Antichrist. But John tells us to look around because they're coming and going all the time. John says that in 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. The mark of an Antichrist is a person who claims extraordinary powers, that they're closer to God than the rest of us, and who exalt themselves while diminishing Jesus. They confuse the body of Christ, and they are accountable to no one and hate being questioned about what they're doing. That personally reminds me of a few televangelists and maybe even the occasional politician or two. But Jesus said it would also be a time of spiritual crisis. The world would be in an upheaval. I mean, do you get the sense today with news of places like North Korea, China, Iran, Russia, or maybe just the entire Middle East making headlines? Do you get this idea that the world is in this sense of upheaval? We have madmen who are trying to get their hands on nuclear bombs. We have countries that are threatening to annihilate other countries like Israel. Sometimes it seems like we're even on the brink of civil war in our own country. And Jesus says this is only the beginning, not the end. And you read that and you think, great, terrific. Really? And it won't be just a time of spiritual and political crisis, but it's a time of creation crisis as well. If you read through the entirety of Matthew chapter 24, you'll see where Jesus says there are going to be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world. And all of this is just the beginning. Now, I don't know where you stand in terms of your politics on global warming, but there's no doubt that Jesus says there's going to be an increase in natural disasters before he returns because the planet, honestly, is just dying to be set free from the death and the decay to which it has been subjected since creation and since sin first entered into the world. In 1988, Edgar Wisnant, he was a former NASA engineer, wrote a book about the 88 reasons Jesus was going to return in 1988. He, of course, revised it to the 89 reasons Jesus was going to return in 1989. He revised his book again in 1993, and then he revised it once more in 1994. Unfortunately, there will be no new predictions for Mr. Wisnant because he passed away in 2001. But now we have people like Hal Lindsey and Pat Robertson and others claiming that they have this end times thing kind of figured out, and I'm just not so sure that they do. But as the end looms nearer each day, it will also become a crisis for Christians. And I understand, church, those aren't happy words. Right now, an estimated 165,000 Christians are killed every year for nothing more than expressing their faith in Jesus Christ. And in an age of tolerance, Christians are not tolerated. We will be fair game. We will be persecuted. We'll be hated. We will be mocked. People we thought were contenders will be exposed, unfortunately, to us as pretenders. Persecution will reveal our faith and separate the real from the unreal. And what's really scary is how Jesus says that our fellowship will be fractured, and some of us will betray the very people that we claim to love. In fact, Jesus said that the mark of these days will be a love that has grown cold. And I think what Jesus meant by saying that is we just won't feel like doing good anymore. This is pretty grim stuff. But there is good news. Jesus basically says, don't freak out when bad things happen. Don't panic. These things have got to take place. And if these things have to take place, then there must be a plan out there somewhere, right? And if so, it must be Jesus' plan. Since the last time I checked, there's no one who can predict the future of world events with any degree of accuracy. In other words, he already knows what's going to happen. He knows when it's going to happen. He knows how it's going to happen. And he knows what he's going to do about it. In the midst of all of this chaos, his people are still going to be talking about the good news everywhere they go. They're not intimidated. They're not afraid. They're not confused, and they are not freaked out. In other words, everything will work out in the end, because if it's not working out, it must not be the end. For instance, I like good political discussion as much as anybody. But lately, I hear people talking about politics in a really panicky way. They talk as if government is either going to save this country or destroy it. But didn't Jesus say some things must take place before the end? And frankly, my hope is not in the government. My destiny is in the hands of God and no one else. And I think it was Jesus who said that he had every intention of meeting all of our needs according to his riches and glory. That's in Philippians chapter 4, verse 19. He wasn't referring to Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae or some multi-billion-dollar bailout plan. And it's Jesus who said that he knows all of your needs, including the very number of hairs on your head. That's Luke chapter 12, verse 7. And it's Jesus who told us not to worry about tomorrow. That's in Matthew chapter 6, verse 34. And it was Jesus who said that he would never leave us or forsake us. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. For instance, do you remember when Jesus was walking on the water? It was in the middle of the night during a pretty vicious storm on the Sea of Galilee. And do you remember Peter? Peter asked Jesus if he could walk out on the water to meet Jesus. And basically, Jesus said, sure, Peter, the water's just fine. Come on out. Do you think there was ever a more nerve-wracking moment in Peter's life than maybe that one? Can you imagine stepping out onto water and seas maybe 6 to 10 feet high? Jesus saying, come on out, the water's just fine. And you're thinking, I really wished I hadn't asked Jesus that question. And although Peter got wet, he did not drown because Jesus reached out his hand and saved him. And church, in the middle of the storm in which we're living right now, Jesus is telling you and me to step out and to rest on his power. In other words, if you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. And despite storm clouds on the horizon, we live actually in a day of tremendous, tremendous opportunity. We live in a day when Christians can really, really be Christians. When the gospel makes sense to a world that is in complete distress. When we can stand out from the crowd. And then this. There is no room in love for fear. Well-formed love banishes fear. Since fear is crippling, a fearful life, which is a fear of death, a fear of judgment, is one not yet fully formed. That's what the Apostle John wrote in 1 John chapter 4, verse 18. I think stated maybe just a little bit differently, we can live fearlessly in the storms of calamity. Take David, for example. I mean, he lived through a lot of adversity. He faced giants both on the field and off the field. In fact, his world was rocked, and he lost absolutely everything that he owned, including his wife, when his former father-in-law, the king, Saul, became jealous of David and decided to spend the rest of his life trying to kill David. I mean, if that were to happen to you, I'm sure you'd feel helpless, right? Maybe hopeless, certainly outnumbered, and that the only way that your circumstances could turn out would be bad, like really, really bad. David's world was in a shambles, but in his moments of distress, he found an amazing truth, one of those like aha moments. Here's what he wrote in Psalm chapter 27, verses 1 through 3. Light, space, zest, that's God. So with him on my side, I'm fearless, afraid of no one and nothing. When vandal hordes ride down, ready to eat me alive, those bullies and toughs, they'll fall. They'll fall flat on their faces. When besieged, I'm just as calm as a baby. When all hell breaks loose, I am collected and cool. In other words, David found a solution to fear, and it was the fact that he worshiped a really, really, really big God. A protecting God. A God who's bigger than the enemy. A God who knows how to fight. A God who is like a fort with walls that won't fall down around it. A God who knows how to make enemies look bad. Pardon me. A God who gives confidence. Listen to another one of David's Psalms. This one, taken from Psalm 46, verses 1 through 7. God is a safe place to hide, ready to help when we need him. We stand fearless at the cliff edge of doom, courageous in sea storm and earthquake, before the rush and the roar of oceans, the tremors that shift mountains. Jacob wrestling God fights for us. God of angel armies protects us. Rivers, fountains splash joy, cooling God's city, this sacred haunt of the Most High. God lives here. The streets are safe. God at your service from the crack of dawn. Godless nations rant and rave. Kings and kingdoms threaten. But earth does anything he says. Jacob wrestling God fights for us. God of angel armies protects us. I think that's pretty encouraging. The greatness of a city that can never fall, a place where the economy is never in a recession, a city where crystal clear river always brings fresh water into the city. It's that city of God. And even though we live in a world that's filled with chaos and problems, we also have a kingdom in which we are now living because I don't know if you've realized, but you have dual citizenship. You live here on this planet, but you also live in his kingdom. So as the Capital One commercial is apt to ask you, whose card are you carrying? Whose kingdom are you in? And where do you spend most of your time? Another psalm from David, Psalm 46, verses 8 through 11. Attention, everyone. See the marvels of God. He plants flowers and trees all over the earth. He bans war from pole to pole. He breaks all the weapons across his knee. Step out of the traffic. Take a long, loving look at me, your high God, above the politics, above everything. Jacob, wrestling God, fights for us. God of angel armies protects us. In a world of problems and in a world of calamity, we don't have to fear. We just need to be still and know that our God has all things under his amazing control. So as we step out into 2021, be still. Be unafraid. Know that he is God, not the government, not the problems, not even COVID-19. God's kingdom cannot be shaken. So as you march out into 2021, be intrepid, be brave, be courageous, be bold, be valiant, and most of all, be fearless. Steve had made a comment that now that we pronounce the new year as 2021, it's as if we are admitting that 2021, that it got the best of us. Not by a long shot. We've learned a lot in 2020, without a doubt. And we're still going to go through it. Habits are not going to get back to where they used to be. Maybe they will, maybe they never will. But we've also learned a lot. As a church family, we've learned that we can adapt. We can worship indoors, we can worship out of doors, we can worship in our cars in the parking lot. And now during Sundays, we're broadcasting over a station that has, a mile or two reach. Who knows? The people in the apartments across the way or the condos to the west of us, maybe they hear. Maybe we're having more influence in their lives than we really even know. And that only happened because we had to protect people and their health and their safety. I'm also reminded of the fact that this year, at least according to most weather people, is what they call a La Nina. And our climate goes through cycles. And so some years there are El Niños, other years it's basically neutral, and other years it's La Nina. So last year is a good example. Last year was an El Nino year. So typically with an El Nino year, we get more rain, but the temperature is probably a little bit more warm because we're getting tropical moisture that gives us all the rain that we get during an El Nino. During a La Nina, it tends to be much drier, but the weather tends to be a little colder. Now, it's not always so pleasant sitting out in the breezeway if it's cold, but at least it's dry. And so maybe the weather came at just the right time to allow us to do what we do as a family in our worship. I don't know. What I do know is that God has all of this under his amazing control. And he tells us that certain things are going to happen before he returns. But he has also promised a life with him forever. and that he has promised us good in the life here and now and in the life to follow. But sometimes to appreciate things in the future requires us to go through some turmoil in the present, because then it just makes us more appreciative of the gifts that God has truly given to us. So church, be encouraged. Be fearless. 2021 has so much promise ahead for us, especially the promise that Jesus loves you unconditionally. He gave his life as an atoning sacrifice for your sins and for mine, so that one day we can live with him